Hello, I'm Gwen Hill from Pine Ridge Baptist Church, Sunday School Department, Ladies Class. And today we're in the 5th chapter of Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. This starts out, Daniel is a senior citizen. He has more or less retired from civic duty. He is probably in his 80s, in his mid 80s. He is a very accomplished statesman with a very stellar reputation. And things are going bad for Babylon. Remember in chapter 2 when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, how he was told, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold in the statue that you dreamed about. But the next one is chest is going to be of silver, which was telling Nebuchadnezzar, your empire is not going to last. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has died. There has been a struggle for who's going to get his empire, who's going to control it. His son, Merodach, was for about 2 years, and then there was about a 5-year period where it was back and forth with different people. And now the person who is co-regent of Babylon is Belshazzar. Belshazzar was number 2. His father was Nab something. I forget what it was. Anyway, he's number 1, but he doesn't live in Babylon any longer. He's gone to Syria. So he left Belshazzar in charge. Belshazzar is, from what we've pieced together about him, Belshazzar has about a 3-year rule. And we are reading about the last hours of his rule. In chapter 5, Belshazzar knows that there are enemies approaching him. The Medo-Persian army is approaching. And this may be a party to boost morale. And a couple of commentators think that. I personally think it's one of arrogance. He thought he was invincible. He thought no matter who marched against him or who tried to take his empire away from him, tried to take Babylon away from him, they would be unsuccessful. His walls were supposedly impenetrable. He had 20 years worth of supplies hoarded. He has fresh water coming through his city from the Euphrates River. And he just feels very invincible, and he's very arrogant. So let's meet Belshazzar on the last night of his reign, chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and the silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Hear the arrogance of the man. He's got 1,000 of his nobles and his warriors in there with him in this great hall, having a drinking riotous party, probably an orgy going on. He's got his wives, he's got his concubines there. And he happens to think, when he looks at the goblet that's holding his wine, hey, there's some gold and silver goblets in the treasury that my ancestor, they called all of their ancestors father. Remember, they called Father Abraham. They didn't mean he was their direct father or even their direct grandfather, but that he was an ancestor in his line. So he called for them to bring them out. So he's showing complete disregard for the holiness that those vessels were held in regard with the Jewish people. He was thumbs up. He was giving the thumb to his people against the God of Israel. He was really showing his arrogance. So they brought him. In verse 3, they brought the gold vessels, which had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Can you hear the talk? So that everybody knew what they were getting when they grabbed up one of those goblets and poured the wine into it. They drank, verse 4, they drank the wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze and iron and wood and stone. And as they were making merry, as they were riotous living, there would have been a lot of a cacophony of noise in there, of people celebrating and people inebriated, drunken orgy going on. I've enjoyed studying the verbiage in verse 5. Quite interesting. Let me read it to you. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand which did the writing. There's 2 or 3 things that Daniel has put in here, that the Lord inspired him to put in here, that are just for our ability to envision what is happening. You have a huge hall, meeting hall, and then you have the opposite wall from where the king is sitting on his desk on the throne. He is looking toward a wall, and the light is behind him, so that he can see it clearly. And this hand, he sees the back of a hand. And the hand is writing. I don't know if it's writing with his finger. I kind of think it is, because we hear different times when God is written with the finger of God's hand. He wrote. He sees the writing. I want you to notice that this is in verse 5. And we are not told what is written at this time. But the king's face, in verse 6, the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. And the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. This is through verse 7. And I really get in the mind your picture. Okay, this man is already 3 sheets to the wind. He's been drinking, he's been boasting, he's been partying, probably for several hours. And through the haze and the fog of his mind, he sees what he would have thought at first was an apparition, something that wasn't truly there, that he was imagining. Surely, can you see him rubbing his eyes? Can you see him straining forward to see what this hand, remember he's seeing the back of the hand, a disembodied hand, a hand that across the room is writing the words big enough that he can see it from across the room and can read it. But it's written in Hebrew. He's not Hebrew. He can't read it. But he knows it's important. Wouldn't you think? Wouldn't you think that those words were very important? How frightened would you be? How drunk would you be now, or would this sober you up right quick? Well, the king saw this, and he knew how important it was. And his face grew pale. From dread, from fear, from anticipation. All of those, I think. His thoughts alarmed him. His mind would have been like a wheel race. It would have been having all different kinds of thoughts. Where did this come from? What does this mean? How is this going to affect Babylon? How's it going to affect me? How do I find out what this means? I've never seen anything like this before. What do I do now? And his hip joints went slack. He lost his ability to stand and hold his stature up. He's having to hold on to something to keep from falling into the floor. If he were sitting on his throne before this, when the handwriting started, he's jumped up to lean forward to see, and now he's finding out he can't hold his own balance. His knees began knocking together. This is real fear. One of the commentators said that he lost control of his bowels and urine at this time. That's what that meant. I'm not going to go there. But needless to say, he was very frightened. Very frightened. Belshazzar was demonstrating that this was well beyond his comprehension, that it was a fearful thing that he was seeing, and his imagination was running riot with what it could be. He lost all semblance of self-control. He had already been mocking God. He committed the sacrilege, sin of sacrilege. He gathered those vessels together. He committed blasphemy against the Lord, and he made fun of the temple and of God himself. And when this hand appeared, he knew. I think he knew. I think his memory went back to what Nebuchadnezzar had told the people in chapter 4. I think his mind went back to that. The witness that Nebuchadnezzar gave about the strength of this God, and he was scared to death because this hand was a hand of judgment. He knew that from the beginning when it began to write. The fingers of man's hand appeared. God, sometimes God uses mysterious ways to communicate to man. Unexpected ways, shocking ways that he can use. And here he used the image of a man's hand. It mysteriously appeared, wrote the phrase on the wall, and then disappeared. Have you ever heard the old phrase, the writing on the wall? He saw the writing on the wall. This is where it comes from. That's where that phrase comes from. Belshazzar's reaction to this was one of extreme fear. And what he wanted to do, now we're going to find out in verse 7. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. These are supposed to be his wise men. You do notice that if he had to call them in, they had not been invited to his party. Wonder about that. The king spoke, and he said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. This is important. I have to know what this says. And he's talking to the Chaldeans. He's talking to the soothsayers. He's talking to the diviners, the conjurers. They've never had the right answer. Do we do that sometimes? Do we talk to everybody but God? problems, even though we have never got the right answer from them. The definition of insanity: doing something, getting a bad result, and then doing it again and again and again and hoping that you have a different outcome. Well, he is beside himself, and he's offering a reward. And he said, any man, any one of you all that can tell me what this means, that you can read this inscription and explain the interpretation of it to me, I'll make you a rich man. A rich man with great authority. You see, necklaces of gold were only worn by the king and by those he agreed to allow them to wear it. This is a sign of power. He said, I'll let you have a necklace of gold. I'll dress you in purple, the royal color, the most expensive fabric. I will provide that for you. Then I'll even go beyond that. I'll make you the third ruler. I'm number 2. My dad's number 1, but I'll make you number 3. I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom. Then in verse 8, all of the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. And Belshazzar the king was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. All the men that he had called in, none of them knew. And they even called some that hadn't come in right away. They came in, they got the news, they couldn't interpret it. They looked at it. They knew it was very important, but they didn't have the answer. Belshazzar is very perplexed, and his alarm is growing by the minute. His anxiety and his perplexion and his overwhelming sense of dread is escalating as he stands there. This riotous room that had been full of laughter and jeering and riotous living kind of noises all over, that was, they probably had music going, fell silent. As you're listening to me, I'm a mom and a grandmom. When the children are little, when do you go check on them the most? When they're quiet. As long as you can hear them making noise, and you can kind of interpret that noise, whether it's playing or anger or conniving little noise, you kind of tell by this where the silences are and how long the silences last as to whether or not you need to go check on them. Well, these are grown men and women. But the Queen Mother heard the silence. Notice she wasn't at the party. In these next verses, pay attention to the Queen Mother and what she says. Put yourself in her position. The Queen entered the banquet. We know it's not his wife, the Queen, because he already said his wives were there with him. So we think this is the Queen Mother. The Queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The Queen spoke and she said, O King, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, and Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of his extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this man Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. The Queen Mother heard the silence. She went to check on him, see what was going on. What would make this riotous party become silent? When she walked in, she gave the king the greeting that he is used to, that is common, that in that culture, everyone addressed the king that way. O king, live forever. It's the same as us shaking hands with someone and say, good afternoon, good morning, how are you? That was just automatically out their mouth. O King, live forever. And she addressed her grandson that way. Her son or her grandson. And first thing she noticed was how pale he was. Even after drinking as much as he had been, as much as he had been partying, he had become very pale. And then he had gotten even paler. The queen noticed immediately, something's wrong with this dude. Because he would have been light brown skinned with dark eyes and dark hair. And here he was, as pale as he could be. And he looked sick. And she became alarmed with him. And he must have told her. I can almost see him, his eyes big and his hand pointing toward the wall with the writing. Can you see her look toward the wall? Of course, she's not seeing the hand now. The hand has come in and wrote, and then the hand is gone. She's seeing what was wrote. She doesn't understand it either. But she understands it wasn't there before the party began. And she listens to him as he tells her, there was a hand. I saw a hand right there. It was disembodied. Just a hand come and wrote those words on the wall. What does it mean? None of these guys can tell me what it means. All these men that I employ to be my wise men, none of them can tell me what it means. What am I to do? This is important. I know it's important. And he was so alarmed. Can you see her reach out a hand and put it on his forearm maybe? And say, "Oh, King, there is a man. Draw your mind back to your father Nebuchadnezzar." She's saying, draw your mind back at least 5 years, possibly even 10. You know Nebuchadnezzar. You remember, we just read in the chapter before this, the chapter written by Nebuchadnezzar, how he had made a profession of faith and how he had told what a wonderful man Daniel was and the power of the God of Daniel. And she says, don't you remember? There is a man. There is a man. There's a man in your kingdom. He has the spirits of the God. Your father Nebuchadnezzar knew, and the king appointed him over all of these Chaldeans and the soothsayers and the magicians and the conjurers. He had an extraordinary spirit, and he's still alive. He's still available to you. He's a resource to you, Belshazzar. His name is Daniel. Send for Daniel to come. And he can tell you what this writing on the wall means, not meant. So, in verse 13, they sent for Daniel. Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke to Daniel. Are you that Daniel, who is the one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now, the wise men, the conjurers, were brought in before me, and that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they couldn't declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed in purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority over as the third ruler in the kingdom. He has sent for Daniel, this 80-something-year-old man. And Daniel has come. I'll be honest with you. It's my godly imagination. Daniel took his time. I can imagine Daniel didn't run like the magicians and the soothsayers and the rest of them ran into the king's office. I can see Daniel taking his time and walking. I'm going to stop here. We'll pick it up here at our next lesson. But I want you, in the meantime, read the next verse or two. Picture Daniel. What is Daniel seeing when he walks into the ballroom? What is he seeing? What does he know? I'll see you next time, and we'll finish the book, the 5th chapter of Daniel. And I hope you have we're getting into the holidays, so enjoy. May God bless.